Have you guys ever asked God to prove himself to you? Like, I remember when I was younger and I would go over to my aunt and uncle's swimming pool. I used to ask God to let me walk across the water, kind of like Peter did, kind of like Jesus did in the Bible. I used to be like, God, there's nobody watching, there's nobody around. Just let me walk across the water of the pool, and then I'll know that you're real. And then I would try to walk across the water, and of course, I would sink immediately. But I remember there was a lot of times in my life where I would ask God to prove himself to me just by doing something small. And my parents used to tell me that I shouldn't do this, that God doesn't need to prove himself to me. But then I read this story in the Bible about a guy named Gideon who did kind of the same thing. And it was really interesting how God responded. See, Gideon was a part of the nation of Israel, right? The God's chosen people in the Bible. And Gideon was actually from one of the smallest tribes in Israel. And Israel had kind of gone through some rough times. If you remember, like from our first week, Israel used to be slaves in Egypt. And then God brought Moses around, and Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery. Well, some time had gone by, and the people of Israel had turned away from God again. They stopped following him, they stopped listening to him, and they even started worshiping other gods. So God allowed another group of people called the Midianites to kind of move in on their land. The Midianites moved in, they had a big army, and they would take food from the Israelites' crops, and they would take the Israelites' stuff. And so the Israelites were, again, kind of living in slavery. And one day, God decided that he was going to raise up another leader to lead them out of this. And he chose a guy named Gideon. Now, Gideon wasn't the obvious choice, right? He was from one of the smaller tribes. He didn't have a whole lot of influence. But nonetheless, God came to Gideon and said, I'm going to use you to drive out the Midianites. Well, Gideon didn't believe it. And so he asked God to prove himself. So the first thing he did is he asked God to perform a miracle or perform a sign. And he had this piece of fleece, right? Fleece is, I don't know if you know, fleece is actually what we get from like sheep. It's, their wool, and when they turned it into clothes, and they turned it into different materials. And so he had this big sheet of fleece, and he told God that he was going to put it outside. And he said, God, if I wake up in the morning and there's dew on the grass, but not on the fleece, if the grass is wet and the fleece is dry, then I'll know that you're really choosing me to do this thing. So Gideon went to bed, and he woke up, and the grass was wet and the fleece was dry. But Gideon still didn't believe it. So Gideon was like, no, God. Okay, one more time. This time, make the fleece wet and the ground dry. So Gideon went to sleep, and when he woke up, the fleece was soaked and the ground around it was all dry. Now, Gideon took a little time, and so he asked God a few more times to prove himself. And so finally, when God did, Gideon was finally like, okay, let's do this. So Gideon gathered an army. He gathered a group of people together, right, from all the different tribes of Israel that were going to help him drive out the Midianites. And before they were getting ready to attack, God said, Gideon, your army's too big. If you win a victory this way, then the people will think that they did it on their own and that it wasn't me that saved them. So gather all of your army together, and if any of them are afraid, ask everyone in your army if they're afraid or if they're nervous or if they're unsure about this, they can go home. And they won't be in trouble. Nobody will think less of them. They can just leave. So Gideon got his whole army together, and he said, if anybody's scared, go home. And a lot of them did. He lost over 2/3 of his army till he only had like 10,000 people left, which was still a decent sized army, but the Midianites had a lot more people. So Gideon was planning his battle, planning his strategy, and God came to him and said, no, your army's still too big. People won't believe that it was me that saved them. So what I want you to do is take them down to the river and let them get a drink. And all of this is, I love this about God. God has these weirdest tests that he does for people. So everybody that drinks from the water like a dog, right? Like they get down on their hands and knees and they go in the water, send them home. But for all the people that like cup their hands and put it in the water and then drink out of their hands like this, they're the ones who are going to stay in your army. So Gideon's like, okay, I guess, God, okay, let's do it. So he takes them down to the water, and he watches how all of them drink. And after he had sent home all of the people that drank like dogs, he only had like 300 guys left. Now, 300 guys is not enough to win a big battle, right? So the only way that the Israelites are going to drive the Midianites out of their land is with a miracle. So God tells Gideon, like, get ready. And Gideon sneaks down to the Midianite camp, and he listens in, and he hears that a couple of the guards talking, and one of them said that they had this dream that a big loaf of bread actually rolled through their camp and crushed them. And the guards thought that this meant that Gideon was going to win a big battle. And so Gideon took this sign as a sign from God that he was going to win, that the Israelites were going to win. And so they went back and they got their plan together. And so what they did is Gideon split his 300-person army into 3 groups, right? And he gave everybody a pitcher, like a jar that had a torch inside, and a trumpet. Not really what you would think you would want to take into a battle, but everybody got a pitcher with a torch in it and a trumpet. And he split his army up into 3 different groups of 100, and they surrounded the Midianite camp. They got all around the camp. And right at the right moment, they all shouted. They all shouted together. They shouted, "A sword for Gideon and a sword for the Lord." And they all smashed their jars and took their torches out, and they blew their trumpets. And when the Midianite soldiers saw this, they saw that they were surrounded, and they saw all these torches, and they heard all these trumpets, and they heard all these people shouting, and they thought they were surrounded. They thought they were being attacked by a really big army. And so they were really confused, and they started running around, and they started trying to get their stuff, and they were so confused that they started to attack each other. They started to attack the other Midianites, and then they started to run away. And so at that point, there was 300 Israelites chasing this huge army of Midianites out of their land for good. And God had saved the people of Israel once again by using one guy who agreed to follow God and 300 select chosen people to be in that army. God was able to win, to lead the people of Israel out of slavery again. Sometimes God's plan is a lot different from our plan. What makes sense to God doesn't always make sense to us. And so we feel like we need to test God, or we need God to prove himself. Like, God, if this is really you, show me. And with Gideon, he actually did. And once Gideon knew that God was really working, he had confidence to carry out God's plan, even if it seemed completely ridiculous and completely opposite of what Gideon would have done. Sometimes when we follow God, he asks us to do crazy things. He asks us to do strange things. He even asks us to do things that make us scared or uncomfortable. But as we've been talking about during the series, when God writes the story of our lives, he knows what he's doing. And if he tells us to do something, it's going to be for the good. It's going to be for our benefit. It's going to help us and not hurt us. When God tells us to do something, when God puts us in a situation, he's always going to be with us to take care of us, as long as we're willing to trust him. So, the next time you're in a situation that doesn't make sense to you, or maybe that you're scared, ask God to show up. Ask God to show himself to you, to make you feel like he's got it in control and that you don't have to be worried or scared. I encourage you to read the rest of the story of Gideon. It's found in the book of Judges, and it's in chapters 6 and 7. Gideon was a fascinating guy, and the story of how he, with God's help, drove out the Midianites is really fascinating, and it's a really encouraging story for when we feel like life's kind of out of control and we don't know what's going on. And when we feel like that, it's good to be reminded that God is in control and God knows what he's doing. Miss you guys. Hopefully I'll see some of you at the movie night tonight. We'll be doing more movie nights the rest of this fall. Hope you guys are having fun with doing school at home. I know it's a little weird and a little crazy, but trust me, God knows what he's doing in this time. So even our lives, they'll get back to normal eventually. Love you guys. See you next week.